The cold that settled over Harlan Falls in the dead of January was not the kind that politely announced itself. It arrived without warning, dropping out of the Montana sky like a verdict, pressing down on the town with the full weight of a season that had learned to be merciless. Not the cold of a single bad night, but the cold of a system, a sustained and total condition that had moved into the valley 2 weeks earlier and showed no interest in leaving. The kind of cold that made the boards of old buildings contract and groan in the night, that turned puddles into mirrors by midnight, that crept through every gap and crack and seam in whatever shelter a person had managed to piece together against it. The kind that did not just lower the temperature, but changed the quality of everything it touched: the air, the light, the sound of the town at 3 in the morning, all of it going brittle and thin and stripped of anything that wasn't essential. Eli Donovan had learned to read that cold the way other 12-year-olds read weather apps on phones he didn't own. He could tell by the particular stillness of the air when the temperature was still dropping versus when it had bottomed out and was simply holding what it had. He could tell by the sound of his own breath by how long the vapor hung in the air before it disappeared, whether he had hours before conditions became dangerous or only minutes. He could tell by the progression of feeling in his fingers inside his gloves, from cold to ache to a numb that was not peaceful, but was at least manageable. And he knew that when the numb moved past manageable, he had to move. His body had to do jumping jacks in the dark, if that's what it took, had to keep the blood circulating in the parts of him that mattered most. He had learned these things not from a book or a teacher or a parent, but from 9 months of surviving in a town that had decided collectively and without much discussion that he did not exist. Harlan Falls was not a cruel place by design. It was simply a small place, and small places have a limited bandwidth for what they register as their responsibility. A town of 4,000 people tucked into a valley between two ridgelines in western Montana, where the same families had worked the same land for 3 generations, where everyone knew everyone else's business, but managed to remain entirely blind to what happened at the edges of the map they had drawn around their concern. The grocery store on Harlan Street, the diner on 5th, the hardware store with its cracked window, the church with the broken gutter nobody had fixed in 2 years, and the abandoned Kellerman's Market on the east end of town with its collapsed awning and its back alley that nobody used since the parking lot had been rerouted, and the foot traffic had followed the parking lot and left the alley to whatever filled empty spaces in small towns. What filled it was Eli. He had found it in early May, 7 weeks after walking away from the Greer household on Sycamore Street and never looking back. The Greers had been his third placement in the Montana foster system, coming after 14 months with a woman in Billings, who meant well but worked too many hours and had too many other children to be able to see any of them properly, in a brief, disastrous stretch in a group home outside Missoula that he had made a deliberate practice of not thinking about. Frank Greer had presented himself to the county as a man of patience and Christian charity. He had not mentioned that his patience extended precisely as far as a child's usefulness, and the county had not pressed the point. Eli had spent 11 months at the Greer property, chopping firewood, cleaning gutters, repainting the fence in summer heat that made the brush strokes go soft, hauling feed bags for the 4 goats Frank kept in the back pasture, and doing the dozen other physical tasks that Frank assigned with the calm certainty of a man who believed work built character, and that a boy who had been moved through the system as many times as Eli clearly needed a great deal of character built into him urgently. The morning Eli left, his hands had been bleeding for 3 days, small splits in the skin at the knuckles from the dry cold and the work, and no one had noticed and no one had done anything about it, not because they were monsters, but because they weren't looking. Frank had told him he was ungrateful, that the county would put him somewhere worse, that boys like him always ended up in the worst places, and had said it with the righteous certainty of a man who had already decided what Eli was and wasn't interested in updating the assessment. Eli had looked at his bleeding hands. He had looked at Frank. He had tried to locate in Frank's expression any evidence that Frank was looking at him rather than at a category he had already assigned Eli to. There wasn't any. Frank was looking at a difficult placement, an ungrateful child, a disruption to the routine. He was not looking at Eli. Eli had walked out the front door with a backpack containing 1 change of clothes, a half-eaten sleeve of crackers, and a library book he hadn't finished. He had carried with him one absolute certainty, the certainty that nowhere could be worse than a place where you were invisible on the days you were not being used. That certainty had been tested many times in the 9 months since. It had not broken. He had built a shelter in the alley behind Kellerman's through the patient accumulation of discarded materials and careful observation of what worked against the cold and what didn't. 2 layers of flattened cardboard boxes against the brick wall, angled to block the wind that came off the ridge to the northeast, which he had identified in June by watching the dry grass in the empty lot across the street. A 3rd layer folded over to form a partial roof. A collection of discarded pallets arranged as a raised floor, which he had understood instinctively but confirmed through one very bad night in October, when he had slept directly on the concrete and woken unable to feel his feet. He had a sleeping bag found behind the Salvation Army donation bin, thin enough to require all his other clothing layered over it on the coldest nights. But real in his, and on the nights when the temperature didn't drop below 0, it was almost enough. Tonight was not one of those nights. He lay awake at 10:30 because the cold wouldn't allow otherwise on his side, with his knees pulled to his chest and his jacket pulled over his face and his hands tucked into his armpits, running the calculations. Temperature still dropping, not yet bottomed out. Wind picking up from the northeast, finding the gap on the left side of his cardboard barrier that he had never fully closed because he had never found the right piece of material. The cardboard roof above him was dry. The pallet floor was doing its job. He had half a granola bar in the inner pocket of his jacket and a water bottle pressed against his stomach to keep it from freezing. He was going to be okay tonight. He told himself this the way he told himself everything that mattered plainly and without decoration, because decoration was a luxury, and he had learned to travel light in every way available to him. It was the sound that made him get up. It came from the far end of the alley where it opened onto the side street. And it didn't belong there, didn't belong to the alley's usual vocabulary of wind and settling wood and the occasional distant truck on the main road. A low sliding sound followed by something that was almost but not quite the sound of a large object coming down muffled and heavy, and then silence. Eli lay still and counted to 11. The sound did not repeat. He sat up anyway. Every rule he had written for himself in 9 months of street survival argued against what he did next. Don't investigate sounds at night. Don't move toward unknown situations. Don't draw attention to yourself or your location. Don't get involved in whatever the darkness decides to produce at the edges of your shelter, because the darkness in a small Montana town produces nothing that a 12-year-old with no legal standing and no adult in his corner has any business engaging with. He pulled on his 2nd jacket, shoved his feet into his shoes without untying them, and walked toward the far end of the alley. She was lying on her left side in the narrow strip of ground between the alley exit and the side street, half in the yellow cone of the one working streetlight and half in the dark beyond its reach. Her motorcycle lay 3 feet from her, tipped onto its side in the snow, the chrome of the exhaust pipe still faintly warm, a small ring of melted snow around it telling Eli the engine had been running recently. The windscreen had cracked down the middle, probably in the fall. One saddlebag had come partially open. The rear wheel still ticked faintly as it cooled. The woman was large-framed in heavy layers, under a leather jacket, dark jeans, boots, with steel-reinforced toes. Her dark hair fanned out across the snow beneath her head. She was not moving. Eli stood at the alley exit for a long time. He noticed things in that time. He noticed her chest was moving barely the faintest rise and fall, that was almost imperceptible against the bulk of her jacket, but was present and was regular, or close to regular. He noticed her left hand was palm up in the snow, and her right hand curled under her body in the way of someone who had not been conscious when they fell, because a conscious person catches themselves. He noticed the patch on the back of her jacket, visible where the jacket had ridden up a winged skull, black and white rendered with care, with the words "Iron Wolves" arcing above it in Montana below. He knew that patch, not personally, but 9 months on the streets of a small Montana town taught you the geography of things whether you intended to learn it or not. You learned the rhythms of authority and what moved outside it. The Iron Wolves were part of that geography, a motorcycle club based out of Dawson Creek to the north, known in the way that thunder is known before it arrives. He also noticed the oil. There was a smear of dark oil on the pavement beneath the motorcycle, which was unremarkable. On its own, older bikes leaked. But the smear continued backward along the street in a thin, continuous line not pulled the way fluid pools. When a vehicle is stationary, but streaked the way fluid sprays from a compromised line when the vehicle is in motion. The line went back about 30 feet before disappearing around the curve of the street, which meant whatever had failed while she was riding. And the front fork of the bike, where it lay against the pavement, had a scratch along the lower tube that caught the streetlight at a particular angle. And the scratch was too clean, too linear, too geometrically consistent to be road damage, because road damage was irregular and this was not. Eli was 12 years old. He had no formal training in anything that would have explained what he was seeing. But 9 months of paying attention to details because details had consequences had given him a way of reading the physical world that didn't require formal categories. What he was looking at did not look like an accident in the way that accidents looked. He walked toward her. He crouched 3 feet away, first close enough to confirm the breathing. It was real shallow and too slow, but present. Her skin at the collar of her jacket was a color that had worried him. Not blue, not yet, but moving in that direction with the quiet determination of something that had time to work with. He looked over his shoulder. Another car moved on the main road a block away, headlights briefly illuminating the buildings before disappearing into the night. It did not slow. He had known before he walked over here that no one was coming. He had known it the moment he heard the sound. In Harlan Falls at 10:43 on a Tuesday night in January, no one was coming because the people who might have come were behind their windows with their heating systems and their settled certainty that whatever was happening outside had not been designated as their problem, and things that have not been designated as your problem can be safely reclassified as not happening. He knew that certainty from the inside. He had been the thing outside the window. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. The cold hit him even through his gloves. Cold in a way that meant she had been here longer than the still warm exhaust suggested, cold in the way of skin that has been losing heat for a sustained period. The pulse was there, thin, irregular, but there. He looked at the distance from where she was to the alley entrance. 40 feet. He did the math. He did it twice. He got the same ugly answer both times. Then he stopped doing math and grabbed her under the arms. She was exactly as heavy as he had calculated, and then some, because there is always something that honest calculation misses about the dead weight of a person who has given up holding themselves together. Her head fell back. Her heels left 2 parallel lines in the snow as he pulled. His shoulders started burning within the first 30 seconds, his breath coming in hard, short bursts that fogged the air in rapid clouds around his face. He stopped after 6 feet and readjusted his grip. His hands had passed through cold into the place past cold where things registered as pressure rather than sensation. He stamped his feet, rolled his shoulders, and leaned back again. He stopped 3 more times on the way to the alley. It took him 19 minutes to cover 40 feet. He marked it not by a clock, but by the progression of his body, by the way burning moved into something that was almost peaceful, the way extreme cold eventually stops hurting and becomes simply a condition. By the time he had her positioned against the sheltered wall behind the pallet barrier, his legs were shaking with a fine, continuous tremor. He couldn't stop even when he held them still, and his lower back had been systematically taken apart. He spread the sleeping bag over her, layered the cardboard roof down on top, looked at the inadequacy of it, unzipped his outer jacket and placed it over her chest, tucked it around her shoulders. Then he sat down beside her and pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her and used his body as the only heating system he had left. He could feel her breathing against him. He focused on that and nothing else. The wind came through the alley in pulses. Somewhere on the main road, a truck shifted gears, and the sound spread across the valley and faded. Eli sat against the brick wall and held on and talked to her in a quiet, even voice, because the sound of his own voice helped him stay awake. He said he didn't know her name and she didn't know his, which made them even. He said the alley wasn't much, but the pallet floor was better than concrete, and she was welcome to it for as long as she needed. He said at some point when the hours had accumulated to the point where he had stopped tracking them individually, in a voice that was quiet and without any particular inflection, "Don't die. Okay. Just don't." He stayed awake by small, deliberate movements, by picking fixed points in his vision and holding them by the arithmetic of his own body's signals, the ongoing calculation of whether the numbers were still positive. They were. He stayed. He was still there, past tired, in the operational clarity that comes when exhaustion has burned away everything non-essential. When she moved, first a tightening along her back, then a low sound involuntary pain arriving before the mind has assembled the context for it. Then her right arm moved, hit the cardboard above her, and she went still again, disoriented. Eli loosened his grip to give her room. She turned her head with the deliberateness of someone working against resistance. Her eyes, when they opened, were dark and not yet focused, moving over him and the alley and the brick wall with careful attention. He waited. She said in a voice scraped down to almost nothing, "How long?" He said, "All night, I think. You weren't waking up." She tried to push herself up. Her left arm buckled, and Eli reached out automatically and steadied her shoulder, and she let him, which surprised him. Adults rarely let him do things on purpose. She got herself to sitting against the wall and stayed there breathing, and he sat beside her and said nothing, because this was a moment that didn't need words. When she looked at him again, it was with the quality of someone assessing accurately rather than dismissing. Her eyes moved over the hollow of his cheeks, the oversized clothes, the shoes that were a size too big. She said, "What's your name?" He said, "Eli." She said, "I'm Nora." He said, "Okay." The way he said most things flatly and without decoration, because social performance required energy he didn't have. She shifted and winced, pressing her hand against her left ribs. She said, "You know what that patch means." He said, "Iron Wolves. Club out of Dawson Creek." She said, "And you're not scared?" He said, "I've seen worse." She was quiet with that, not dismissing it, taking it in and deciding what to do with it. She said, "How old are you?" He said, 12. She looked at him for a long time. She did not ask why he was out here alone. He noticed that. Most adults would have asked immediately, already preparing their response while he was still answering. Nora just looked and accepted it. She said, "Do you have anyone?" He said no. She nodded once, slowly confirming something she had already suspected. After a while, she said, "You gave me your jacket." He said, "You needed it more." She said, "What did you use?" He said, "I stayed close." She looked at him for a long time after that. Not with pity, which he would have recognized and resented. Not with the manufactured warmth adults sometimes produced around children in difficult circumstances. She looked at him with something he didn't have a word for, yet something that felt like being accurately perceived. Like the image she was forming of him corresponded to what was actually there rather than to what was convenient. He found he didn't know what to do with that. He looked away first. She pushed herself to standing with one hand on the wall, and Eli stood too, without thinking, positioning himself to catch her if her legs gave way. They didn't. She walked to the alley exit and stood looking at her bike in the snow. She was very still. Then she crouched down slowly and with clear pain and looked at the front fork where it lay against the pavement. She tilted her head at a particular angle. She ran one gloved finger along the lower tube without quite touching it. Eli watched her face from just inside the alley entrance. What he saw was not surprise. And that was the detail that settled into the place in him where important things went, because he knew the difference between someone discovering something and someone confirming something they had already considered possible. Nora was confirming, which meant she had known this was possible before she rode out tonight, which meant this was not simply a motorcycle accident on a winter road. She stood and came back and stood against the wall and looked at the far end of the alley for a long time. Her face had closed into something flat and controlled the face of a person holding information behind a carefully maintained surface. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a phone with a cracked screen and a battery at 11%. She looked at it for a long time before pressing call. When someone answered, she said 4 words. She said, "Alive, Harlan Falls, come." She ended the call before whoever it was could respond and stood with the phone in her hand. Eli said, "Your family." She looked at him sideways. She said something like that. She put the phone away and leaned her head back against the wall, and for a while neither of them said anything. The wind moved through the alley in its irregular way, and somewhere far off a dog was barking. Eli said, "Dawson Creek is 3.5 hours. She said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." She looked at him. He said, "I can stay." She said, "You've been up all night." He said, "I know." He sat back down and stayed awake through the remaining hours by sheer stubbornness, watching the sky above the alley entrance for the first gray edge of morning. Around 4 in the morning, she said without preamble, "Why did you stop?" He knew what she meant. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything that mattered, because he did not see the point of anything other than honesty when honesty was the available thing. He said, "You looked like someone the world already gave up on." She didn't respond. He said, "Same as me." The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Warmer somehow, as if something that had been held at a distance had been allowed to come slightly closer. He said, "I've been out here 9 months. You see a lot of things out here. And the thing I've seen most is people looking at the road instead of at what's beside it. I didn't want to be one of those people. Nora was quiet for a long time. Then she said very quietly, almost to herself, neither did I, once. He didn't ask what she meant. He understood she wasn't finished with it and that asking would close it rather than open it. He sat there and let the sentence be what it was. At 4:53, the sound arrived. Faint at first, so faint that he thought his tired brain was constructing it. But it didn't fade the way imagined sounds fade. It grew. A low, rolling vibration that came through the ground before it arrived in the air, multiplying on itself, approaching from the direction of the southern highway. Nora's head came up. Eli walked to the alley entrance. The headlights came around the curve of the highway in formation spaced, and even not the randomness of ordinary traffic, but something organized and deliberate. They turned onto Harlan Street and kept coming bike after bike, settling into rows along the street, with a precision that spoke of people who had done this before, who knew how to occupy a space without disorder. He counted and lost count somewhere above 60. Nora came to stand at his shoulder and looked at the street full of riders and said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Told you they'd be here." He said, "How many?" She said, "Enough." The engines idled down and cut off one by one, and the silence that followed was the full silence of a large number of people being deliberately quiet, which was somehow louder than the engines had been. A big man came forward from the head of the formation. Late 50s gray in his beard, old scars on his hands, eyes that took in everything without making a production of it. He walked to the alley entrance and stopped and looked at Nora and then at Eli. He said, "You must be the kid." Eli said, "I guess." The man said his name was Grady. Just the name as the whole introduction. Eli said Eli. Grady looked at him and looked at Nora, and something passed between them that was too compressed to decode. Nora said quietly, "He stayed all night." Grady looked back at Eli. Eli looked back at Grady. The man nodded once with the weight of someone who understands exactly what staying all night in serious cold costs and what it says about the person who did it. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The sun was beginning to come up behind the eastern ridge, a thin, pale line of light along the tops of the mountains. And Harlan Falls was beginning to wake at its edges, lights in windows, a door opening somewhere. The morning was arriving with the slow inevitability of all morning, carrying forward into the day, whatever the dark had made. Eli stood at the entrance to the alley and looked at the street full of riders and felt something in his chest that didn't have a name yet, and he put his hands in his pockets and stood there and let the morning come. Harlan Falls did not wake up gracefully on the best of mornings, and this was not the best of mornings. The town came to consciousness the way small towns do in the dead of winter, reluctantly, and in pieces of light here, a truck engine there, the distant sound of a door pulled open against the cold and shut again quickly as whoever had opened it reconsidered the temperature. By 5:45, the sky above the eastern ridge had moved from black to the gray that precedes color. And the gas station 2 blocks north had lit its sign, and the town was technically awake, even if most of it had not yet decided to engage with being awake. The 72 motorcycles parked along Harlan Street were impossible to miss. They sat in two precise Rose engines off chrome, catching the early light, and their riders stood or sat nearby with the settled patience of people who are accustomed to waiting without complaint. No noise beyond low murmur of occasional conversation. No disorder, no aggression, only presence massive and deliberate, the kind that changes the character of a space simply by being in it. Eli watched from the alley entrance. He had been watching long enough to notice things. The way the riders moved in relation to each other with the easy economy of a group whose bodies had learned each other's rhythms. The way Grady occupied the center of the formation without requiring that the center be acknowledged, just naturally holding it. The way several riders had glanced toward the alley entrance in the past 20 minutes, not with hostility, but with the specific awareness given to something that has been described as mattering. He was aware that he was the thing they had been told mattered. He was not sure what to do with that. Nora stood a few feet to his left with her phone plugged into a portable charger. One of the riders had produced within 30 seconds of the group's arrival, talking quietly to a lean man in his mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a leather jacket that was older than the others, creased with the specific texture of something lived in for a long time. His name was Gage. He had arrived with a canvas messenger bag in addition to his saddlebag, and the bag contained, among other things, a tablet and a portable hard drive and several manila folders. And manila folders were not what you brought to a situation like this one, Unless you had a specific reason for them, Eli filed that away. The town was getting more awake by degrees. A woman had come out of a building across the street and stopped dead when she saw the formation of bikes standing with her car keys in her hand for a long moment before retreating back inside with speed. A man walking a dog on the far end of the street had crossed to the opposite sidewalk without breaking stride eyes forward in the practiced way of someone who has decided not to see what is directly in front of them. Harlan Falls had learned to look at the road. It was 6:12 when the county cruiser turned onto Harlan Street. Eli saw it before anyone else reacted because he was already facing that direction, and because official vehicles had a particular quality of approach he had learned to recognize. The white and green cruiser moved slowly and pulled to the curb, half a block from the head of the formation, sat with its engine running for a moment, then the door opened. Sheriff Vance Pruitt was 53 years old and built in the way of a man who had been athletic in his youth and maintained enough of it to remain imposing. Gray blonde hair, cut close. A face arranged through long practice into an expression of reasonable concern. The face of a man who was here because concern was his function, because the welfare of this community was something he took personally. And it was a face that had worked extremely well in Harlan Falls for 11 years because no one had seriously challenged the thing it was covering. He walked toward the formation with that face fully deployed, hands visible, pace unhurried, projecting the ease of a man who has never been uncertain about his standing. Grady moved to meet him. They spoke briefly in the cadence of two men who have met before and have already formed opinions requiring no revision. Then Pruitt's eyes moved past Grady to the alley entrance, to Eli. The look lasted less than 2 seconds before moving on. But in those 2 seconds, something moved across his expression that was there and gone before it completed itself. Something living underneath the reasonable concern, like a second expression wearing the first as a mask. Eli felt the hair at the back of his neck respond. He stayed where he was. Pruitt moved with Grady back toward the alley, and Nora straightened as they approached. Engaged stepped back, but stayed close. The group that gathered was small and specific. Grady, Nora, Pruitt, 2 deputies at a distance. Pruitt looked at Nora and said he was glad she was all right. He said his office had received a report of a motorcycle down, and they had been preparing to respond. But by the time the report was processed, it appeared the situation had already been. He paused with the precision of a man choosing a word carefully managed. Nora said she was fine. She said she appreciated his concern. Pruitt said, of course. These things happened on winter roads, especially on a night like last night. Glad no serious injury had resulted. Then his eyes moved to Eli, and this time they stayed. He looked at Eli with the reasonable concern, face fully operational, and said, "Son, how are you doing this morning?" He said Eli was clearly a remarkable young man, and the community was grateful for what he had done. He said the county had resources, a very good facility, people who could help figure out next steps, get him a hot meal, and a real bed. He said it with the fluency of a man who has said those words many times in that exact order. Eli did not move. When Pruitt said the word facility, something happened in his body before his mind had caught up to articulate it. His feet went flat and firm against the ground. His hands found the insides of his jacket pockets. He looked at Pruitt. He looked at the reasonable, concerned face. He ran the arithmetic fast and quiet in the back of his mind while his face stayed still. He took 1 step to his left. Nora was 2 feet away. He moved close enough that he had to look up at her and kept his voice below the ambient noise of the street, below the distance to Pruitt's ears. He said, "Don't let him take me there." Nora looked down at him. He said 3 names. He said Danny Weaver, Marcus Flynn, Little Pete Cross. He said them the way he said things that mattered quietly and without drama. Because quiet things without drama have a way of reaching people that shouted things don't. And he had learned this from 9 months of being the person nobody shouted at because nobody was listening enough to bother. He said, "I knew all 3 of them. From out here, they all went to that shelter, the county facility he's talking about. None of them came back. I don't mean they died. I mean nobody knows where they went. They stopped being somewhere anyone could account for, and nobody who was supposed to keep track of them kept track." He said, "I've been out here 9 months. When you don't have anywhere to be, you hear things. People talk to me because I'm a kid. They think I won't remember." He stopped. He said, "I remember everything." Nora held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back toward Pruitt. She said, "He's fine where he is." She said it simply and without room for negotiation. Pruitt's expression shifted. Just enough, he said. Surely she understood that a child sleeping in an alley was a matter of concern, that there were protocols, certain things required of him professionally, regardless of personal preferences. Nora said she understood and that Eli was under her supervision for the time being, and she would take personal responsibility for his welfare. Pruitt looked at her. He looked at Grady. He looked at the 72 bikes on the street and absorbed the geometry of the situation. He said, I see. Well, he said if there was anything his office could do, they were available. He said he hoped everyone had a safe onward journey. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to retreat from positions without appearing to retreat to leave situations that are not going his way with the same face he brought into them. He walked back to his cruiser. Eli watched him go. He watched the specific way Pruitt walked, and he noted that before reaching his vehicle, Pruitt stopped briefly and spoke quietly to the deputy on his right, and the deputy took out his phone and typed something, and then they got in the cruiser and it pulled away from the curb. Eli noted that. He noted the typing especially. Grady came to stand beside him. He said after a moment, what did you tell her? Eli said 3 names. Grady looked at him. Eli said kids who went to that shelter and disappeared. I know more than 3. I told her the 3 I knew best. Grady looked at Nora, who was already moving back toward Gage, the 2 of them leaning over Gage's tablet with the focused intensity of people who have shifted from waiting into working. Grady said quietly, how many? Eli said 9 that I know about. Probably more. I only know the ones other kids on the street told me about directly, but 9 I can confirm. Grady looked at him fully, then the complete attention of a man who is recalibrating something significant. He said, how do you know? The details. Eli said, I've been out here 9 months. You talk to enough people who don't have anywhere to be, you start to hear things that nobody else is hearing because nobody else is talking to those people. He paused. He said, they talk to me because I'm a kid. They figure I'm not going to do anything with it. He paused again. He said, I remember everything I hear. I always have. Grady looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, come with me. They walked to where Gage and Nora were standing, and Gage looked up from his tablet, and Grady said one word, tell him. Gage looked at Eli with the direct attention of someone who has been told something worth paying attention to. He said his name was Gage Mercer. He said that before he rode with the Iron Wolves, he had spent 14 years as a financial crimes investigator with the federal government following money through structures designed to make that movement invisible. He said he had been building a file on Vance Pruitt for 2 years at Nora's request. He said, I have the financial record. Shell Companies accounts 4 years of transactions moving in patterns consistent with a specific kind of crime. What I don't have is the operational piece, the human piece. Financial records tell me money moved. They don't tell me what was being exchanged for it, who was on the other end, what it looked like from the ground. He looked at Eli. He said, you said 9 names. Eli said 9 that I'm certain of. Gage said dates. Do you remember when they disappeared? Eli looked at a fixed point on the ground and went through them in order. He said Danny Weaver marched 2 years ago. Marcus Flynn, October the same year. Little Pete Cross last winter, January or early February. Jesse Roth, spring of last year, April. Tommy Decker, summer, I'm less sure of the month. Annie Locke, September. Callie Boone, November, middle of the month. Ray Briggs, I don't have a date that was before I got here. I only know about him from someone who knew him. Weston Ford, December 6 weeks ago or so. He looked up. Gage was looking at him with an expression doing its best to stay professional and largely succeeding, but not entirely. Gage said, you've never written any of this down. Eli said, I don't have anywhere to keep anything written down. Gage said, it's all in your head. Eli said, yes. Gage looked at Grady. Grady looked at Nora. Nora looked at Eli. Something moved between them in a sequence compressed and specific, the communication of people with long shared history who don't need many words. Nora said 9 months. Eli said 9 months, yes. She said, you've been carrying all of that for 9 months. He said, I didn't have anywhere to put it. The morning was fully arrived now. The sky had gone to pale, flat blue, and the sun was clearing the eastern peaks, hitting the chrome of the bikes and throwing small, bright points across the storefronts of Harlan Street. The temperature had not risen and would not rise much, but the character of the cold had shifted from the aggressive cold of deep night to the settled cold of a winter day, which was a different kind of thing to navigate. More people were outside now. A small cluster had gathered at the corner of Harlan and Fifth, far enough away to be technically uninvolved, close enough that nothing happening here would escape their notice. A man had come out of the hardware store 2 blocks down and was standing in his doorway with a coffee cup, making no pretense of doing anything other than watching. Harlan Falls was watching. Gage said, "I need to make some calls. The FBI field office in Billings. I have a preliminary contact there. They know the case exists. But to formally initiate action, I need corroboration from the operational side. Someone who can speak to names and dates and the movement of specific children through a specific facility." He looked at Eli. He said, "You're that person." Eli said, "Okay." Gage said, "I want to be clear about what I'm asking. Once you give a formal statement to federal investigators, you become part of a process. People will want to talk to you probably more than once." Eli said, "People have never wanted to talk to me before." He said it as information, not self-pity. He said, "I'm okay with people wanting to talk to me." Gage looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded and stepped away to make his calls. It was while Gage was on his phone that Pruitt came back. From the north end of the street, this time on foot, with 2 deputies and a third man, who was not in uniform, heavy-set mid-40s, wearing a jacket that did not quite conceal the fact that he was carrying, walking slightly behind the deputies, with the movement of someone following instructions and prepared for them to change. Eli saw them coming. He said quietly to Nora he came back. She had already seen. Along the street, the quality of the rider's stillness shifted, subtle but total. The formation had been at rest. It was now at attention. The difference was minimal in appearance and absolute in substance. Pruitt walked up to Grady with the reasonable concern, face back in full operation, but something had been concentrated and compacted in it since the last conversation. He said there were mandatory reporting requirements he was obligated to follow. He said these were procedural, not personal, and surely everyone understood that procedures existed for good reasons. He said, "I'm going to need to take the boy into protective custody for his own welfare and for compliance with county mandates." The street went quiet. Not the quiet of absence, the full quiet of 72 people deciding simultaneously not to speak. That many people not speaking creates a silence with weight. Pruitt stood in the middle of that weighted silence with his reasonable, concerned face and his deputies and the heavy man slightly behind him. Eli was 8 feet from Pruitt. He felt Nora beside him, Grady in front, Gage 20 feet away with his phone at his ear. He felt the cold coming off the street and up through his shoes. He felt the weight of 9 names he had been carrying for 9 months with nowhere to put them. Pruitt looked at him. He said, "Son." He said, "Come on now." He said, "This is for your own good." He said those last 5 words, the way people say things they have decided are true without spending much time checking. Eli looked at him. He thought about Danny Weaver, who was 11 when he stopped being somewhere. He thought about little Pete Cross, who had been 9. He thought about Gage's words, "You're that person." He took a step forward, not toward the cruiser, toward Pruitt. He stepped out from behind Grady and stood in the open space between them, 12 years old and 100 pounds and wearing shoes a size too big. And he looked up at the sheriff of Harlan Falls, and he opened his mouth. He said, "Danny Weaver." Pruitt's expression moved, just slightly. He said, "Marcus Flynn." He said, "Little Pete Cross." He said, "Jesse Roth." He said, "Tommy Decker." He said, "Annie Locke." He said, "Callie Boone." He said, "Ray Briggs." He said, "Weston Ford." He said each name with the same weight and clarity, one after another, level and plain, the way you say something that doesn't need to be made more than it already is. The way you say something that has been waiting a long time to be said in a place where it can be heard. 9 names, 9 children, said out loud on Harlan Street on a January morning, while 72 people stood still and listened to every one of them. When he finished, he held Pruitt's eyes and did not look away. Pruitt was very still. The reasonable, concerned face was still technically assembled, all its parts in their correct positions, but the animating principle behind it had changed. The thing behind it now was not concern, reasonable or otherwise. The heavy man, who would later be identified as Cobb Briggs, had moved his hand inside his jacket. Eli heard Nora's voice, sharp and immediate. Eli back. He stepped back. What happened next was fast in the way things are fast when they have been building toward a specific moment and the moment finally arrives. 2 people stepped out from behind the far end of the motorcycle formation. They were not riders. They wore different jackets, and they moved with the specific purposefulness of people who have been waiting for a signal and have now received it. One of them had federal credentials visible in her hand before she was halfway across the street. Grady moved laterally, and 2 riders from the front of the formation moved with him in the coordinated way of people who have rehearsed proximity. A voice said clearly and without urgency, "FBI, don't move." Riggs made a decision, and it was the wrong one, and Grady was there before it resolved into anything consequential, and then Riggs was face down on the pavement with Grady's knee between his shoulder blades. Grady said quietly and without heat, "You are going to want to not do that." The deputy on Pruitt's right stepped back. He put both hands up, the gesture of a man separating himself from a decision that is no longer his to make. The federal agent with the credentials was beside Pruitt, now speaking in the level tone of someone delivering information, not requesting it, not suggesting it, informing. Pruitt looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him. 15 feet of January Street between them. The sheriff of the county and the 12-year-old boy who had been sleeping behind the abandoned grocery store because someone in a position of authority had decided to keep him there. Then Pruitt looked away. And Eli understood in that moment of looking away something he had not quite been able to articulate before, something about what had been done to him and what he had believed was happening to him, which were two very different things. And the understanding of that difference was going to take time to fully absorb. But the first edge of it arrived now here on this street in this cold morning. He stood where he was and let the morning do what it was doing around him, and he breathed the cold air in and out, steady and even, and he was still there. Gage came back from where he had been standing with his phone. He walked with the particular purposefulness of a man who has just completed something that required considerable effort and is now on the other side of it. He came to stand beside Eli and looked at the scene in front of them. Pruitt with the federal agent, the deputies separated from their sheriff Riggs on the ground with Grady maintaining position. The careful bureaucratic machinery of a federal arrest unfolding in the cold morning air. He said to Eli without preamble, 2 years. Eli said, "What?" Gage said, 2 years I've been building that file. Financial records, shell company, documentation, transaction, logs, correspondence between entities that didn't want to be connected to each other. 2 years following money through structures designed specifically to make it impossible to follow. He paused. He said, "I had everything except the piece that makes it real. The operational piece. The names, the dates, the specific movement of specific children through a specific facility at specific times corresponding to specific transactions in the financial record." He looked at Eli. He said, "Without that piece, what I have is a detailed picture of money moving in patterns consistent with a crime. With that piece, it becomes a case. In a federal prosecution, what you need is corroboration from someone who was present in the operational reality of it. Someone who can say, yes, this is what it looked like from inside it. These are the names. These are the dates. This is the place." Without that, the defense spends 6 months attacking the financial analysis and the jury goes home uncertain. With it, the financial analysis becomes the frame and the testimony fills it, and what you have is a case that holds. He said, "You were that piece." Eli said, "I just remembered things. That's all I did. The things were already there. I just remembered them." Gage said, "Yes. And the people whose job it was to remember those things, the agencies, the caseworkers, the county officials, none of them did. Or they did, and they didn't act. And you who had no job, no resources, no standing, no one to report to you, carried 9 children's names and the approximate months they disappeared and the facility they came from, and you held all of that for 9 months in your head because there was nowhere else to keep it." He said it plainly, not with drama. He said, "That matters." Eli said, "Okay." He looked at the street. He looked at the federal agents working through the steps of an arrest. He looked at Pruitt, who had the stillness of a man who has run his remaining calculations and found them all negative. He looked at the riders still at their bikes along Harlan Street, patient and present. He looked at the alley entrance behind him. He put his hands in his pockets and stood there and let the morning move around him. At 7:44, one of the federal agents came to where Eli was standing. She introduced herself as Sandra Okafor. She was the one who had approached Pruitt at the moment of the arrest, and she had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who moves through difficult situations by treating them as a series of manageable components. She crouched slightly to be at his eye level, which he noticed and appreciated, and told him she understood he had information relevant to the case and that she would need a formal statement. She said it would be done with all appropriate protections. She said he was not in any trouble. She said nothing he said would be used against him in any way. She said it in the clear, factual tone of someone communicating information rather than performing reassurance, which was how he preferred things said. He said, "I know, I don't have anything to hide." She said, "I know you don't." She said it the same way as information, not as comfort. They went to Kepler's diner, the four of them, Eli, Nora, Agent Okafor, engaged with his canvas bag. The diner had not changed in 30 years and made no apology for it. Vinyl booths the color of faded mustard, a counter with round stools, a coffee machine that sounded like it had opinions about early mornings. The woman behind the counter took in the leather jacket and the federal credentials visible on Okafor's belt and said, "Booth in the back, help yourselves." They sat in the back booth. Eli ordered coffee without considering whether this was something 12-year-olds were supposed to order because he had been awake for 24 hours and his body required it, and the woman brought it without comment and also brought a plate of toast that nobody had requested, which appeared without explanation, and which Eli understood was the diner's quiet acknowledgement of what the morning appeared to contain. He ate the toast while Okafor set up her recording equipment, and Gage organized his materials, and Nora sat on the outside of the booth with her left arm held careful against her ribs. Okafor said, "Whenever you're ready." Eli said the 9 names. He said them in the order he had learned them. After each name, he said what he knew, the approximate time of disappearance, the age of the child when he knew it, who had told him, and in what circumstances where the child had been, in the period before going to the county shelter, and the specific shape of the disappearance as it had been described to him by people on the street who had known that child. He said these things in the flat, even voice that he used for information that mattered. The voice that didn't add emotion because the information was already what it was. He talked for 47 minutes without stopping. He consulted no notes because he had no notes. Everything came from the organized place in his memory where he kept the things that mattered, organized by the specific quality of how he had learned each one. The face of the person who had told him the particular light of that day or night. The exact words used which he had kept with a fidelity that sometimes surprised even him when he accessed it. Gage cross-referenced it in real time, his tablet open to the financial records, and 3 times during Eli's account, Gage said a specific date, and Eli's information met it from the other direction, a child disappearing from the visible world. At the exact moment, a specific transaction had moved through one of the shell company accounts in a way that now made a different kind of sense. 3 times during those 47 minutes, Okafor stopped typing and simply looked at Eli. Each time she resumed without comment. When he finished, she sat back and looked at her recording equipment for a moment, and then at Eli. She said, "How old are you?" He said, 12. She said, "And you've been living outside 9 months." He said, "Yes." She was quiet. Then she said, "Eli, I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as clearly as I'm saying it. What you just gave me is more corroborated, more operationally specific, and more useful than anything we have been able to build from the documentary record alone. You just gave 9 families the beginning of an answer they have not had." Eli said, "Okay." She said, "I mean what I'm saying." He said, "I know you do." He looked at the coffee cup. He said, "I just remembered things. The things were already there. I just remembered them." Nora said from across the table quietly, "That's the whole thing, Eli." He didn't answer. They were in the diner for nearly 2 hours. When they came back out onto Harlan Street, the shape of things had changed in the way that things change when the active part of something has concluded and the administrative part has taken over. The county cruiser and the federal vehicles had gone. Riggs had been transported. Pruitt had been transported. 2 deputies were still present, talking to agents. A third sat in his own vehicle, looking at the steering wheel with the expression of a man doing a very thorough internal accounting of his recent decisions. The riders were still there, all 72 of them, still at their bikes, still present with the unhurried patience of people who have not been given a reason to leave and do not need one to stay. Grady came over when he saw them come out of the diner. He said, "You holding up?" Eli said, "Yes." Grady said, "That was a hard morning." Eli said, "I've had harder." Grady said, "I know." He said it simply without overcompensating. He said, "There are things we need to talk about. Practical things." He said it, and then he said, "But first there's something else." He walked toward the formation, and Eli followed him past the rows of riders who acknowledged his passage with attention, the quality of attention given to something that matters. At the center of the formation, near the head of the rows, a rider stood holding something. A quiet man, 50s, with the patient hands of someone who worked with them. What he held was a leather vest, small, size for Eli's dimensions. The leather was new, not yet broken into the texture of wear, and the stitching was clean and even and had been done with care. On the back, in letters that were deliberate and properly sized, was a single word. Guardian. Not guardian angel, Not any elaboration, just the word which was sufficient and accurate and did not need anything added to it. Nora came to stand in front of Eli. She took the vest from the rider's hands and looked at it for a moment, her thumb moving along the stitching on the back. Then she looked at Eli. She said, "Can I?" He nodded. She placed the vest over his shoulders. It settled there with a weight that was real, the weight of the leather and the care that had gone into making it, and also another kind of weight, the weight of intention of a thing made specifically for him, not found or adapted, but made. She crouched down in front of him, careful with her ribs, and came to his eye level. The morning light was in her hair, and her face was in partial shadow, and her eyes were clear and direct, the same dark, focused eyes he had first seen when she woke up in the alley. "She said you didn't just save me last night." She paused. "She said you saved 9 names that nobody else was going to remember. 9 children who needed someone to hold on to what had happened to them until someone with the ability to act could hear it. You held those names for 9 months, alone, in the dark, with no reason to believe anyone was ever going to ask." She stopped. She said, "Do you understand what that is?" He looked at her. He thought about it honestly. He thought about the 9 months and the arithmetic and the names kept in the organized place in his memory. He thought about all the times he had turned them over, the weight of each one, the face of the person who had told him the specific quality of the light on that particular day. He said, "I understand it now." She nodded once. She stood back up. The rider with the patient hands began to applaud. Slow and deliberate, a single pair of hands in the cold morning air. Then another pair. Then another, moving along the formation the way something moves when it finds its rhythm, growing not in speed, but in presence, until 72 pairs of hands were coming together in a rhythm that was not the loud volume of a crowd celebrating, but was steady and sustained and full of something that had no better word than respect. The earned kind, the kind that comes from a specific act that is understood by the people witnessing it. Eli stood in the middle of it. He put his hands in the pockets of the vest and looked at the ground for a moment, and then looked at the sky, which was the flat pale blue of a Montana January, when the storm has passed and the air has gone clean, and everything is very cold and very real. He felt the thing in his chest that had been building all morning. It had grown through the events of the day into something that occupied more space than he had known he had available for it. It pressed against the inside of his ribs, and it did not have a name yet, but it was something he thought he might be able to carry, unlike the names which he was finally, as of this morning, not carrying alone. He did not cry. He had not cried in 9 months. He had learned in those 9 months that crying required a particular kind of safety, the knowledge that you could afford to be something other than functional, and for 9 months he had not been able to afford that. The thing in his chest pressed, and he breathed through it, and he did not cry, but it was closer than it had ever been, and he thought that closeness was probably something worth noting about this day. The applause settled. Riders moved back toward their positions in the quiet way of an aftermath, people reorganizing after the concentrated part of something has passed. Grady came to stand beside him, Nora on his other side. For a while, all 3 of them stood in the January morning and looked at the street and the bikes and the pale sun on the storefronts, and nobody said anything, and the silence was the comfortable kind. Then Gage appeared from the direction of Kepler's and walked toward them with his canvas bag over his shoulder and the expression of a man carrying something he needs to put down. He stood in front of Eli. He said, "There's something you need to know." He said it carefully in the tone of someone not sure how a piece of information will land. Eli said, "Okay." Gage said, "When I was cross-referencing your timeline with the financial records this morning, I went back through the CPS files that Nora has been collecting over the course of this investigation. Specifically, the social services records connected to the children whose names you gave me. And I found something in those records that I need to tell you about." Eli waited. "Gage said your name is in those files." Eli said, "I know. I've been in the system since I was 4. Gage said, "Not like that. Your file in the Montana CPS database has a specific notation. A flag. It goes back almost 2 years, placed in the system by a county official. It marks you as high-risk, non-compliant behavior pattern, unsuitable for standard foster family environment." He paused. He said those notations are specific language that gets read by caseworkers when they are matching children with families. When a family inquires about fostering a child in a certain age range, if a profile has those notations, that child is not presented to the family as a candidate. The family is told no suitable matches are available. The child never knows a family asked. He paused. He said in the 18 months those notations have been in your file, 3 families inquired about fostering a child in the 10 to 14 age range in this county. All 3 were told no suitable matches were available. 2 had specifically requested a child between 10 and 14. He said the notations were placed by the county, by Pruitt's office. The words landed. Eli stood very still. He ran the arithmetic on what Gage had just told him, and the calculation was not complicated. It was, in fact, the simplest calculation he had run in 9 months. It came out to a single answer with a single meaning. He said after a moment, very quietly, he kept me out there on purpose. Gage said yes. Eli said, because I knew things. Gage said, because you were a witness who had no standing, no documentation, no legal guardian, no caseworker paying attention. Everything you knew was your word against the word of a county official of 11 years standing. He kept you where your knowledge had no value, where it couldn't reach anyone, Eli said in the families. Gage said yes, those were real inquiries, real families who wanted to take in a child your age. They were turned away, and you were never told they asked. The street was very quiet around this information. Nora and Grady said nothing. They let it be what it was in the open air without rushing to cover it with words. Because it was not small and it was not easy, and covering it would have been a disrespect to what it was. Eli looked at the ground. He thought about the Greer house and the 11 months and the bleeding hands that nobody noticed. He thought about the way it had felt to walk out that front door with the certainty that he was leaving, because something in him didn't work, because he was the variable in every equation that never came out right, because whatever it was that made children placeable and keepable, he simply didn't have. He had believed that for 9 months. He had believed it with the conviction of someone who has evidence from every direction, who has been moved through a system that is supposed to find you a place and has not found you a place, who has watched doors close without apparent reason and has supplied the only available explanation himself. He said so quietly it was nearly to himself, I thought it was me. Nobody spoke. He said I thought there was something about me that didn't fit, that I was the thing that didn't work. That every time a door closed, it was because of something in me that was wrong. He stopped. He stood with that for a moment. Let it sit in the cold morning air. Nora moved in front of him. She didn't crouch this time. She stood close enough that he had to look up, and she said it was not you. She said it the way you say something that is the most important true thing you have said all day. Not loudly, without emphasis. With accuracy, which is its own kind of force. She said it was never you. He looked at her. Something moved in him that he didn't try to identify. He let it move. He said, I know that now. She said, make sure you keep knowing it. The kind of thing that was done to you doesn't go away just because the person who did it has been arrested. It takes work to undo. It takes time. It takes people who are paying attention. But I want you to know right now on this street that the story you have been telling yourself about why you are out here is not the true story. He said, okay. She said the true story is that someone in a position of power looked at a child who was a threat to him and decided to make that child invisible in a system that already wasn't paying enough attention. And the child didn't disappear. The child stayed. The child remembered. And this morning, the child walked out into the street and said 9 names out loud when it would have been easier and safer to say nothing. She said that's the true story. He looked at her for a long time. He said, okay. The thing in his chest was the largest it had been. It pressed against his ribs from the inside and still didn't have a name, but it was something he thought he might be able to carry, unlike the names which he was finally, as of this morning, not carrying alone. He put his hands in the pockets of the vest and stood in the cold and let the true story settle into the place where the other story had been, where it would take time to fully replace it, but where it had now begun. Grady said from behind him, there are practical things we need to discuss. Eli turned. Grady said the case, what it requires over the coming weeks, the formal witness process, what the federal investigators will need from you and when, the protections available to a minor who is a primary witness in a federal prosecution, which are substantial and will be fully applied to you. He said it level and direct, not inflating it and not minimizing it. He said, and there is the file, the CPS file with the notations. That needs to be corrected. The notations need to be removed and the record restored to what it should have been from the beginning. Gage is already in contact with the state office in Helena, and that process will begin today. It will not be instant. These things move at the speed of bureaucracy, but it will happen, and it will be done correctly. He paused. He said that doesn't give you back the 9 months. He said it directly because it was true and needed to be said rather than papered over. He said 9 months is real. What was done to you is real. Nobody here is pretending otherwise. Eli said, I know. Grady said, what I can tell you is that from today the record will be honest. What Pruitt did to your file will come out of it. And there are people, me included, who are going to make sure that the other pieces are properly addressed. Placement, stability, somewhere real. Not today. Today there's too much happening. But the conversation has started. Eli nodded. He understood this was a beginning and not an ending. He understood the arithmetic of what came next was more complex than any calculation he had run in 9 months, because surviving alone in an alley was in many ways simpler than navigating a future that suddenly contained other people in it, in a different way. People who were paying attention. People making commitments. People whose presence added weight to the positive side of the ledger in ways he hadn't yet learned to account for. He understood all of this and didn't try to calculate it all at once, because some things were too large for that. He stood in the cold and let it be what it was. Gage came to him one more time. He said, I want to say something to you. Eli waited. Gage said, 2 years I worked on that file. He said, I'm good at what I do. I was good at it when I did it professionally, and I'm good at it now. I followed that money through 17 different structures, and I documented everything that could be documented, and I built the strongest financial case the evidence allowed. And at the end of 2 years, what I had was a very detailed picture of a crime without the human face of it. Without the proof that the abstractions corresponded to real children, real dates, real lives. He said financial records are not testimony. They are consistent with a crime. They suggest a crime. But in a federal prosecution, what you need is corroboration from someone who was present in the operational reality. Someone who can say, yes, these are the names, these are the times, this is what it looked like from the ground. Without that, the defense attacks the financial analysis and the jury goes home uncertain. With it, the financial analysis becomes the frame and the testimony fills it. And you have a case that holds. He said you were the case. He put his hand out. Eli looked at it for a moment. Then he took it and shook it. The handshake of a man who meant it, offered to a boy who was 12 years old and had been invisible for 9 months, and the boy took it and meant it back. At 10:53 in the morning, the Iron Wolves began to move. Not all at once, not with a signal, just the gradual reorientation of a large group of people who have finished what they came to do and are preparing for what comes next. Engines starting in ones and twos. Riders settling onto their bikes. The formation loosening from its precise rows into the more fluid shape of departure. It was not dramatic. It was simply movement, practical and purposeful. Some of them nodded at Eli as they moved past. Not all, but some, and the ones who did nodded, simply a single downward movement of the head, the gesture of one person acknowledging another. He nodded back each time with the same economy. The last to leave were Grady and Nora, and 3 riders who stayed for the logistics, and Grady's truck, a dark blue pickup that had been parked on the side street, was brought around to the front and the remaining bikes loaded onto a trailer. Before the loading was complete, Nora came to stand beside Eli. She said, I need to go to Billings. She said the follow-up work for this case meetings with the federal team, and there are other things I've been working on that connect to what happened here and that I need to see through. She paused. She said, I'm asking if you want to come. He looked at her. He said to Billings. She said yes. He said why? She said because you just spent 9 months alone with 9 names and nowhere to put them, and I think you have done enough alone for a while. He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about everything. He said, I don't have anything to bring. She said, I know. He said, I've got the vest. She said, that's enough. He looked at the street. He looked at the storefronts of Harlan Falls in the winter sun. He looked at the alley entrance behind him, the narrow gap between buildings, the shadow inside. He had lived there for 9 months. He had built a shelter through patient accumulation and sustained it through 2 seasons and learned its specific geometry, the exact angle of the cardboard that blocked the northeast wind, the placement of the pallets that kept the ground cold from coming up. It had kept the numbers positive when every other variable was negative. It had been the thing he could rely on to still be there in the morning, which was more than he could say for most things he had encountered in the 12 years. He gave it a moment of honest acknowledgement. Then he said, what else is in Billings? She said, follow up on the case. Meetings with the federal field office. She said it carefully. She said Weston Ford, the last name you gave me. 6 weeks ago. He went to the Dawson Creek County facility, which we have reason to believe is connected to this operation. We think Weston may still be in a traceable location. If he is finding him starts in Billings. Eli said nothing for a moment. He thought about Weston Ford. He thought about the specific afternoon in November when a girl named Callie, who slept in the park on warm nights, had told him about Weston, who had been Callie's friend, who talked too much and was funny, and had once given Callie his last granola bar because she was hungrier than him, who had gone to the facility because a caseworker had told him it was temporary and he would be placed with a family within 30 days. Callie had been crying when she told him. The quiet contained crying of someone who had learned that crying loudly didn't produce results. He said, okay. She said, okay. He said, let's go to Billings. Something moved in her face that was uncomplicated and real. They walked to the truck. Grady was already at the wheel with the engine running. Nora got into the passenger seat and braced her left arm carefully against the door. Eli opened the rear door and climbed into the back seat and pulled the door closed. The warmth hit him in a wave. He had been cold, varying degrees of cold, for so long that warmth had become something he experienced as the absence of cold rather than as a positive thing in itself. But the heat coming through the vents moved through him like something that had been waiting for permission to arrive. He leaned his head back against the seat. Grady pulled out onto Harlan Street, and they drove through Harlan Falls, past Kepler's, with its lights on, past the hardware store, past the corner of Harlan and Fifth, where the last few observers were finally dispersing, past the space where the motorcycle formation had been, which was just a street, now an ordinary street with the specific quality of a place where something has been that is no longer there. They reached the south end of town and turned onto the highway. The valley opened up around them as they gained elevation, the ridgelines dropping away to reveal the longer sight lines of open country, the mountains moving on either side. The road was clear and straight and went a long way ahead into the pale blue distance. Eli looked out the window at the mountains. He thought about the 9 names. He said them through in his mind one final time, in order the way he had said them all morning, and as he finished the last one, he let them go. Not the way you forget things, not that he would never forget them. They were in the organized place in his memory, where things that mattered stayed. But let go of the weight of carrying them alone. Let them pass from the place where he had been the only keeper into the hands of the people who now had them and who would know what to do with them. He let out a breath. He thought about something else. Something Nora had said in the alley in the early dark of the morning when they were sitting against the brick wall and the wind was coming through in pulses and the stars were very clear above the alley entrance. She had asked why he stopped, and he had told her what he had told her. But sitting here now in the warmth of the truck with the mountains going past, he thought it was incomplete. Because the other thing, the simpler thing underneath all the words, was just that she was there and she needed help. And he was the person who was there. Not because of what she represented or what any of it meant. Just because she was there and he was there. And the question had been simple. You stopped or you didn't. He had stopped. And 9 months of paying attention in the dark had made that stopping into something more than a single act on a single cold night. But it had started with the simple thing, with the question, with the answer he had given, without quite deciding to give it out of something that was older and simpler than calculation, that was in him before the arithmetic, before the rules, before 9 months of surviving had taught him to be careful and contained. He thought he would try to keep that thing. He thought it was worth keeping. Nora said from the front seat, without turning around, "There's food behind my seat if you're hungry." He said, "Maybe in a little while." She said, "Okay." The highway went south into the mountains, and the country opened around them. The occasional farmstead set back from the road with smoke from its chimney, the long white fields between the tree lines, the peaks above white and cold and immense, the way mountains are immense, in a way that doesn't require acknowledgement. Eli thought about Weston Ford, who was funny and talked too much and had given away his last granola bar because someone else was hungrier. He thought about finding him. He thought about what it would mean to Callie, who had cried in the quiet, contained way of someone who had learned that loud crying didn't produce results. He thought it was worth going to Billings for. He thought a lot of things were worth doing, actually. More than he had thought 9 months ago. More than he had thought this morning before the sun was up. The arithmetic was running in the back of his mind the way it always ran, and the numbers were different from what they had been. The variables had changed. New things had been added to the positive side of the ledger, things that didn't cancel out at dawn or blow away in a northeast wind, things with weight and consistency. He thought he would need to learn new arithmetic. He thought that was a reasonable thing to need. He was very tired. He had been awake for something past 24 hours, and the warmth and the motion of the truck were combining into a condition his body recognized as an opportunity for what it had been needing since 10:30 the previous night. His eyes were heavy, the mountains outside were very real and very still, and the sound of the engine was a low, even sound, the kind of sound that doesn't ask anything of you. He thought about the arithmetic one final time. He ran it in the back of his mind the way he had run it every night for 9 months, checking the variables, checking the balance, making sure the numbers came out positive. They did. They came out the most positive they had come out in 9 months, not by the narrow margin of survival, but by something broader, something that had room in it for things other than the next hour and the next night and the next calculation. Today, the positive had room in it for Billings, for Weston Ford, for whatever came after that. He did not think about the alley. He did not think about whether the cardboard would hold, or whether the pallet floor would be enough, or whether the northeast wind would find the gap he had never managed to close. He did not think about it because it was not his calculation to run anymore, and the understanding of that was the last thing he was aware of before the motion of the truck and the warmth of the heater and the weight of 24 hours finally gently and without drama put him to sleep. Outside, the windows Montana went past in the cold winter light, the mountains and the long roads and the pale blue sky, and the river running somewhere below the grade of the highway, dark against the white of its banks. The country went past all of it, indifferent and immense, and unaltered by what the morning had contained, because country like this has seen too much to be altered by a single morning, no matter what that morning held. But in the truck moving south through it, something had been altered, something small and specific and not visible from the outside, the kind of alteration that happens in a person, rather than in a landscape, the kind that doesn't show until later, until you look back and try to identify the moment when things began to be different, and find that it was this one, this particular morning, this particular cold and what it contained. The truck moved south, and Harlan Falls fell away behind it into the valley, growing smaller in the rearview mirror, and then disappearing around the curve of the highway, and the mountains closed around the road on either side, and the road went ahead into the pale blue distance. Grady drove with the calm of a man who has been driving long roads for a long time and knows how to let a road be what it is. Nora sat with her left arm braced carefully against the door and looked out at the country going past and said nothing and didn't need to. And in the back seat, with one hand resting in the pocket of a leather vest that had his name on it, in the only way that mattered, which was that it had been made for him specifically and not for anyone else, Eli Donovan slept. He did not dream about the alley. There were things about living outside that people who had never done it did not understand, and Eli had stopped expecting them to. The misunderstandings were usually the same ones repeated with minor variations. People thought the hardest part was the cold, or the hunger, or the loneliness, or the danger. All of those were hard, but the hardest part was something else entirely. The hardest part was invisibility. Not the invisibility of being ignored, though. That was part of it. The deeper invisibility was the way the world around you continued to function, as if you were not a data point in it. Cars drove past, businesses opened and closed, people walked dogs and bought coffee and argued about football games and worried about their mortgages and lived inside the unexamined assumption that the world was a place that noticed them. And you stood or sat or lay in the margins of all of that and understood, gradually and then completely, that you had been subtracted from the equation, that the world's math still worked fine without you in it. Eli had learned this not dramatically, not in a single moment, but over many hundreds of ordinary moments that accumulated into a truth he could not argue with. The moment when a woman on the sidewalk looked directly at him and then looked away so quickly that you could see the decision being made in real time. The moment when a store owner came out and told him to move along, not angrily, not cruelly, just flatly, with the particular flatness of a man dealing with a category rather than a person. The moment when he realized that he had not been directly addressed by another person in 11 days, that 11 days had passed in which no one had spoken to him except to tell him to leave or to ask if he had any money. The 9 names had been a response to that invisibility, not a conscious one, not a strategy, but a reflex of the kind you develop when survival requires paying attention to what others are not paying attention to. He had started collecting the names because the children they belonged to had been made invisible in the same way he had, And because the specific texture of their disappearances had a quality that distinguished it from the ordinary invisibility of children who had nowhere to be. There was something calculated about it, something that had been organized rather than merely neglected. He had known this without being able to articulate it the way you know things that you don't yet have the vocabulary for, the way you carry a weight without knowing what to call it. He had carried it for 9 months. And now in the warmth of Grady's truck, moving south through a Montana January, he was not carrying it alone for the first time, and the difference between those two states was something he was only beginning to be able to feel, the way you only begin to feel the full weight of something after you have put it down. He had not put it down entirely. He would not put it down entirely for a long time, possibly ever, because the names were real and what had happened to the children they belonged to was real. And reality did not go away because you wanted it to. But there were other people holding it now, and that was different. That was the thing that was different. He did not have a word for how it felt. He thought perhaps he would learn the word later. The truck moved south. He had been awake when they passed through the edge of Harlan Falls, watching the last of the town's buildings go past the window, the gas station and the feed store, and the small cluster of houses at the south end that had been built in the 70s when someone had thought the town was going to grow and then hadn't grown. He had looked at all of it with the specific attention of someone who has memorized a place without intending to, who knows the schedule of its lights and the names of its streets and the sound it makes at 3 in the morning when the temperature drops and the buildings contract. He had not thought he would miss it. He didn't know yet if he would. But he looked at it as it went past, and he acknowledged it the way you acknowledge something that has been part of your life, even when it wasn't the life you would have chosen. Then the buildings ended, and the highway opened up, and the mountains came in on both sides, and the town disappeared around the curve of the road behind them. Grady drove with his hands easy on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and the particular quality of presence that very self-contained people have, a completeness that didn't require any supplementation. He had not said much since they had gotten in the truck, and what he had said had been practical. The specific location of the food Nora had mentioned, the estimated drive time to Billings, a brief and factual account of where they would be staying and what the next day or two would likely look like in terms of meetings with the federal investigators. Eli had listened to all of it with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, filing it in the organized place, keeping it available. Nora had been quiet since they pulled out of Harlan Falls, looking at the country going past her window with the focused inward quality of someone running through things that needed to be run through. Occasionally, she shifted her left arm and her jaw tightened slightly, and then she repositioned and the tightness eased. She had not complained about her ribs. She would not complain about her ribs. Eli had learned enough about her in one night and one morning to understand that complaining about things she could manage was not how she operated. He understood that, actually. He understood it quite well. The mountains were doing what mountains do in winter light, which is to be very large and very cold and very indifferent to human concerns in a way that is either terrible or comforting, depending on what you bring to it. Eli had spent 9 months finding it comforting. The ridgelines that enclosed Harlan Falls had been a constant in a life that had very few constants reliable in their dimensions, the way almost nothing else was reliable. He had looked at them every day from the alley entrance and found in their unchangingness a particular kind of stability that didn't ask anything of him. Now, different mountains were going past the window of the truck, and they were the same in the way that all mountains were the same, immense and cold and indifferent. But the specific geometry was different, and he was moving through them rather than looking at them from a fixed position, and that was a different relationship to have with them. He thought about the fact that he was moving. He had not moved in a meaningful sense in 9 months. He had moved within the boundaries of Harlan Falls, between the alley and the dumpsters behind the grocery store, where he sometimes found discarded food, between the alley and the library 2 blocks over where he spent time when the weather permitted, and when the librarian, a thin woman named Mrs. Hewitt, was working rather than the other librarian, who had asked him for his library card and then asked him where his parents were and then had picked up the phone in a way that had required him to leave quickly. He had moved within a circumscribed radius determined by safety and weather and the arithmetic of not attracting attention. But he had not moved, had not gone somewhere, had not been in transit toward a destination in 9 months. The feeling of it was strange. Not bad, just strange, the way any change feels strange when you have been stationary for a long time. He looked at the road ahead going into the pale blue distance and thought about Weston Ford. He thought about Callie. He thought about the specific afternoon when she had told him about Weston. Not in the alley. He rarely brought people to the alley because the alley was his, and bringing people there felt like something he wasn't ready to do. But on the steps of the old post office on the corner of Harlan and 3rd, which had been closed for 2 years and where the steps were sheltered enough from the wind to sit in November if you had enough layers on. Callie had been 12, the same age as Eli, and she had been in and out of the system for as long as she could remember, which was not quite as long as Eli, but close. And she had the particular quality of competence that children develop when they have had to learn to manage things that children are not supposed to have to manage. She could tell you where to find the warmest shelter on a given night, and which businesses left their side doors unlocked, and which dumpsters were restocked on which days, and who on the street was safe and who was not, which was the most important category of knowledge of all. She had known Weston from 2 placements back. They had been in the same group home for 5 months and had become the kind of friends you become when you are in a situation where friendship is both necessary and risky, the kind where you share information and look out for each other without quite saying that's what you're doing, because saying it makes it something that can be taken away. She said Weston had gotten a call from a caseworker about a placement possibility. She said he had been excited about it in the way that kids in the system learn not to be excited about placement possibilities, because being excited and then being disappointed was worse than not being excited at all, but that Weston had not quite learned that lesson yet, or had not been able to apply it in this instance. She said he had told her it was temporary, a transition facility, and that from there he would go to a family, a real family, within 30 days, and that the caseworker had said it explicitly, 30 days. She said she had not seen him after that. She said she had asked the caseworker, the one she reported to at the time, and the caseworker had said Weston had been placed and was doing well, which was the kind of answer that contained no specific information and was therefore not an answer, just a response designed to terminate the conversation. She said she had asked again 2 months later and been told the same thing. She said she had stopped asking because asking produced the same answer and the same answer produced nothing. She had been crying when she told him. The quiet contained crying of someone who had learned that crying loudly was a performance that nobody came to see. Eli had listened to all of it and filed it in the organized place and had thought about it many times in the months since, not obsessively, not in the way that it eats at you, but in the way of something that sits at the edge of your awareness and waits for a context in which it becomes relevant. The context had arrived this morning. He looked out the window at the mountains going past and thought about 30 days. He thought about what 30 days meant to a 12-year-old boy who had been told specifically and explicitly that in 30 days he would be with a family. He thought about what happened to the certainty of 30 days when 30 days came and went and the family did not materialize. He thought about what came after that. He did not let himself think about what specifically might have come after that because he had seen enough of the world to have possibilities in that direction, and none of them were things he wanted to think about in the warmth of this truck, moving through these mountains with the cold held at a distance for the first time in 9 months. He would find out what had come after. That was what Billings was for. He looked at the road ahead. The highway curved around the base of a long ridge, and the river appeared below them for the first time, running dark and narrow between its frozen banks, and Eli watched it as they moved alongside it, the dark water moving against the white of the snow, the specific motion of water that doesn't freeze, that keeps moving through the winter because water has no choice but to keep moving. He thought that was a reasonable thing to be. He thought he was going to try to be that. He thought he had been trying for 9 months, actually, without quite knowing that was what he was doing. Without the language for it, just the practice of it, the daily and nightly and hourly practice of keeping the numbers positive and staying in motion, even when motion was only the motion of staying where he was and keeping himself alive until the next morning. He thought that practice had led here. He thought here was not where he had expected to arrive, but that arriving here was better than the alternative. Outside the truck, the river ran alongside the highway for a while, and then the road curved away from it, and it disappeared behind the rise of the next ridge, and the mountains continued on either side, and the sky above them was the flat, pale blue of a Montana January that had settled into itself for the duration, cold and clear, and without drama. Eli leaned his head back against the seat. He was still awake technically, but the boundary between awake and asleep had gone thin, in the way that boundaries do after 24 hours without sleep. And the thoughts that were moving through him were less sequential than they had been an hour ago. Less organized, more like the long, trailing edge of something running out of momentum. He thought about the vest. He reached into the pocket of it with one hand and pressed his fingers against the inside, feeling the stitching from the reverse. The person who had made it, the quiet man with the patient hands, who had stood in the center of the formation holding it, had sewn it with care. You could feel the care from the inside, the evenness of the stitching, the consistency of the tension. That was something you couldn't fake. You could rush a stitch, but you couldn't make a rush stitch feel like a careful one when you ran your fingers across it from the back. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had taken time specifically for him. He did not have a word for how that felt either. He thought maybe there were a lot of things that were about to happen to him that he did not have words for yet, and that he would need to develop new vocabulary as he went, the way you develop vocabulary for things you have not yet encountered by encountering them. He thought that was a reasonable way to proceed. He thought about the diner, about Kepler's and the toast that appeared without being ordered, which had been the diner's version of acknowledgement, a small and concrete gesture that asked nothing in return. He thought about the 47 minutes he had sat across from Agent Okafor and said the 9 names and the dates and the context and all the surrounding detail that he had been keeping in the organized place in his memory for 9 months. He thought about the way Okafor had stopped typing 3 times and just looked at him, and the specific quality of those looks, which was not pity and was not skepticism, and was something that he thought might be the professional equivalent of being seen clearly. He thought about Gage's handshake. He thought about the word Gage had used. He had said you were the case, not you helped with the case or you contributed to the case. You were the case. Like Eli himself, his 9 months of careful observation and memory and carrying had been the essential piece without which the other pieces could not hold. He had spent 9 months believing he was the variable that didn't work. He had been, in fact, the variable that made everything else work. He turned that over in the slow trailing way of a mind that is very tired and is approaching sleep from a direction rather than being overtaken by it. You were the case. He thought about that. He thought about Danny Weaver and Marcus Flynn and Little Pete Cross and Jesse Roth and Tommy Decker and Annie Locke and Callie Boone and Ray Briggs and Weston Ford. And he thought about the fact that their names were now in the hands of people who would know what to do with them, that the testimony he had given in the back booth of Kepler's diner that morning had entered the machinery of accountability and would move through it slowly and perfectly in the way that bureaucratic machines move, but would move. He thought about Callie, who was still out there somewhere, who had sat on the steps of the old post office in November and cried in the quiet, contained way and talked about Weston Ford, who was funny and talked too much. He would find out about Callie. He would make sure Grady and Nora knew about Callie. He would tell them everything he knew about where she was and what her situation was, because Callie was not one of the 9 names, but she was real, and she was out there, and she deserved to be found with the same urgency that Weston deserved to be found. He would tell them that. Not right now. Right now, his thoughts were going slow, and the road was going past, and the mountains were doing what mountains do, and the engine was the low, even sound of something that doesn't ask anything of you. Right now, he would let the morning catch up with him. Right now was enough. The morning Nora had left Dawson Creek 6 days before she ended up in a Harlan Falls alley in the January cold, she had told Wade Carver she was going alone. Wade had looked at her the way he looked at things he disagreed with, but had learned not to argue about with a particular quality of stillness that meant he was storing the disagreement rather than spending it filing it away for later use. He had said, you know, I could send someone with you. She had said, I know. He had said Harlan Falls is Pruitt's territory. You know what that means. She had said, I know what it means. He had looked at her for a long moment. He had known her for 11 years, had ridden with her through things that had tested both of them in ways they didn't discuss. Much had watched her be reckless in the specific way of people who are reckless because they are carrying something heavy, and the carrying has made them indifferent to certain categories of personal risk. He had known all of that about her for 11 years and had learned in those 11 years which arguments were worth making and which ones she had already made to herself and resolved in a direction he was not going to change. He had said, be careful, Rook. She had said, I'm always careful, which was not true, and they both knew it was not true, but it was the kind of not true thing that you say because saying the true thing would require opening a conversation that you don't have time to have. She had ridden south. The source she was going to meet in Harlan Falls was a woman named Grace, a former county caseworker who had worked under Pruitt's administrative oversight for 8 years and had quit 14 months ago and had been trying to figure out how to talk to someone about what she had seen for 14 months without knowing who could be trusted. She had found Nora through a chain of 2 other people. The way information finds its way to the people who can use it when it has been looking for a destination for a long time. Grace had information about specific children, specific dates, the specific mechanism by which children in the county shelter disappeared from the official record. She had documentation she had kept quietly and at personal risk because she had not known what else to do with what she knew, and she had not been able to simply stop knowing it. Nora had been 2 miles outside Harlan Falls when the front brake had failed. She had felt it before she understood it, the particular absence of resistance that tells you, before your mind has caught up, that something fundamental is not there anymore. She had downshifted, used the rear brake, controlled the speed, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been riding for 20 years and has encountered equipment failures before, and she had been managing. It would have been fine, would have gotten the bike stopped on the shoulder with minimal drama, except that the curve had come up faster than she had accounted for, and the rear brake alone was not enough, and she had gone down. She did not remember the impact. She remembered the sound of the exhaust pipe hitting the pavement, which was the last thing she heard before everything went dark, and she remembered the cold, the specific quality of the cold against her face, which was the first thing she was aware of when she began to come back. And then she remembered the weight of something against her back and the sound of breathing. And when she had turned her head, she had found the boy. 12 years old, 100 pounds, wearing shoes a size too big, had dragged her 40 feet through the snow, had given her his only jacket, had stayed. She had spent 11 years with the Iron Wolves, and she had learned in those 11 years what it looked like when someone did something out of calculation versus out of something older and more basic than calculation. She had learned the difference between a person who helped you because it was to their advantage and a person who helped you because helping was simply what they did when helping was the available thing. Eli Donovan was the second kind. She had known it the moment she asked why he had stopped, and he had told her she looked like someone the world had already given up on. Same as me. She had known it not from the words, but from the quality of them, from the specific flatness of them, from the way he had thought about it before answering, rather than producing a response that was designed to make him look good. He had not been trying to look good. He had not even been thinking about how he looked. He had just answered because the question had been asked, and he had an honest answer for it. She had spent 11 years with the Iron Wolves, and she had not always been certain about the people she rode with, but she had been certain about Eli Donovan within about 90 seconds of him opening his mouth. The thing she had not told him, the thing she had been carrying in the truck alongside everything else she was carrying in the truck, was about Cole. Cole was not her son. He was her nephew, the son of her younger brother Daniel, who had died 8 years ago in the specific and preventable way of a man who had problems he did not know how to ask for help with. Cole had been 4 when Daniel died, and their mother had been in no condition to take him, and there had been a period of 2 years during which Nora had been trying to get formal custody while Cole moved through transitional placements. And during that period, Cole had gone through the Montana foster system and had ended up for 7 months in a facility in Dawson Creek that was no longer operating. She had gotten custody eventually. Cole was with Grady's family, now had been for 4 years, was doing well, was 13, and played too many video games, and had recently become interested in astronomy in the way of kids who have found something that makes the world make sense to them. He was fine. He was more than fine. But she had seen in those 2 years what the system did to children when the system was functioning in good faith, which it mostly had been in Cole's case. She had seen how children disappeared inside the administrative machinery of it, how they became files rather than people, how the people responsible for them could be managing 30 or 40 files simultaneously and could not be blamed specifically for the fact that a given child was not being seen as a person. But how the result of that mathematics was that children who needed to be seen as people were not being seen as people. And then she had started through Gage's financial work to see what the system did when it was not functioning in good faith. When the administrative machinery had been captured by someone who understood exactly how children disappeared inside it and had found a way to make that disappearance serve his purposes. That was when she had started coming to Harlan Falls. She had come 3 times in the past year. quietly without telling Grady more than he needed to know, because Grady knowing everything would have meant Grady sending people with her, and she had not wanted people with her, had not wanted the weight of other people's safety on top of the weight of what she was carrying. That had been an error in judgment. She could see that now. The error had put her in an alley in January dependent on the body heat of a 12-year-old boy who had been put there specifically by the man she was investigating. She could see the irony of it. She was not sure irony was the right word. She was not sure she had the right word for it. Maybe she would ask Eli. He seemed like someone who thought carefully about words. She looked out the window at the mountains going past and thought about Grace, the caseworker who had been waiting for her in Harlan Falls, and who would have gotten no answer when she tried to reach Nora, and would have spent the night in a state of uncertainty that Nora was going to need to address as soon as possible. She pulled out her phone and sent a brief text, "I'm all right. Meet in Billings instead. We'll explain." And she put the phone away and looked at the mountains. In the back seat, she could hear Eli's breathing, which had gone slow and even in the way of someone who has finally stopped fighting, sleep, and let it take over. She did not turn around to look at him. She just listened to the specific quality of his breathing, the breathing of a 12-year-old boy who had been awake for 24 hours carrying things no 12-year-old should have to carry finally resting. She thought about his face when he had said, "I thought it was me." She thought about the specific flatness of it, the same quality as his voice when he answered questions, the quality of someone saying a thing they have turned over so many times that it has lost its edge, that has been thought about so thoroughly that even the pain of it has been processed into something that is just information, just a fact about the world that you have accepted because you had no alternative. She thought about what it took to carry something like that for 9 months, what it did to a person, what it left behind. She thought he was going to be all right, not because the world had suddenly become a place that was going to treat him well, because it wasn't. It was still the same world, still full of the same indifferences and failures and calculated cruelties. But because he had something in him, that those 9 months had not touched the thing that had made him stop at the end of the alley when every practical instinct told him to keep walking, the thing that had made him stay all night, the thing that had made him step out in front of Pruitt and say 9 names in a voice that did not waver. That thing was real and it was his and it was not going anywhere. She thought he was going to be all right. She looked out the window at Montana going past and thought about what the next few days were going to look like. The meetings with the federal investigators in Billings, the formal processing of the case, which would be long and bureaucratic and would require patience she was going to have to consciously maintain. The search for Weston Ford, which was the next thing after the formal meetings, the thing that she had been working toward for 2 months and which was now, because of Eli's testimony, close enough to be a realistic goal rather than a hope. She thought about Grace, who had been carrying information for 14 months and who deserved to be heard. She thought about the 9 names which were now in the hands of people who could do something with them. And she thought about the families who would begin to get answers in the weeks and months ahead. And she thought about the specific quality of those answers, which would not be the answers anyone wanted, because the answers anyone wanted were the ones that made it not have happened. And that was not the available answer, but that there were answers at all was something. That was something. Grady said without taking his eyes off the road, "She's sleeping." Nora said he. Grady said, "He's sleeping." Nora said yes. Grady was quiet for a moment. Then he said Gage sent the financial package to the Billings field office at 6:50 this morning. He said they've confirmed receipt. He said they are going to want to move quickly on this because of the way these things work, the window for certain kinds of asset seizure being what it is. Nora said, "I know." Grady said they're also going to want Eli. Nora said, "I know." Grady said he's going to need someone formally in his corner, not just practically, legally, someone who can be present at the interviews, someone who can make sure the federal process doesn't do to him what the county process did to him. Nora said, "I know, Grady." He was quiet again for a moment. He said, "Are you going to be that person?" She looked at the mountains. She said yes. He said, "Okay." He said it the way he said things that mattered simply and without elaboration because the elaboration was not required. He said, "I'll talk to our attorney in Billings. Get the paperwork started." She said, "Okay." They drove in silence for a while. The mountains moved. The river appeared below them again briefly and then disappeared. A cluster of cattle stood in a snow-covered field on the right side of the highway, steam rising from them in the cold air. And Grady slowed slightly as they passed a ranch gate and then accelerated again. Nora said he told me 3 names before he told Gage 9. Grady said I know. She said he sized up the situation before he committed to it. He didn't tell me everything immediately. He told me enough to make his point, and he waited to see what I did with it. Grady said smart kid. She said very smart kid. She said 9 months on the street. She said he's been doing that kind of calculation every day for 9 months, and he's still doing it. He doesn't trust automatically. He extends information carefully and watches what happens to it. Grady said that's going to serve him. She said it's already served him. He said the question is what he does with it when he doesn't have to do it anymore. When trust isn't something he has to ration. Nora thought about that. She said he'll figure it out. Grady said yes. The mountains went past and the road went ahead, and in the back seat the sound of Eli's breathing was steady and even, and the morning was doing what mornings do, which is to become the next thing. And then the thing after that, not knowing what it contains, carrying what has been given to it forward into whatever comes next. There was a specific quality to the silence in the diner booth during those 47 minutes that Gage would remember later when he was asked about the case in ways that required him to describe it rather than just document it. He had sat across from a 12-year-old boy in a vinyl booth in a diner in a small Montana town in January, and he had watched that boy recall 9 months of carefully stored information with a precision and consistency that would have been notable in an adult witness and was in a child witness. Something he had not encountered before in 14 years of professional work or the 2 years since. He had cross-referenced it in real time. The financial record he had spent 2 years building was a record of abstractions, of numbers moving through structures of dates and amounts and account identifiers that corresponded to patterns he had learned to read, but that were not in themselves evidence of anything that a jury could be expected to feel. They were the skeleton of a crime, the bones of it, the structural evidence that something had been organized and sustained over time. But bones without flesh were not a person. A financial pattern without human corroboration was not testimony. Eli had provided the flesh. 3 times during the 47 minutes, Gage had set a date from the financial record, a date that corresponded to a transaction of a particular size, moving through a particular channel, and Eli had without hesitation provided a name and a rough description of the circumstances of a child's disappearance that placed that child in that facility at that time. The correspondence was exact in 2 of the 3 cases and close in the third, close enough to be within the margin of Eli's acknowledged uncertainty about that particular date. He had known in those moments that what he was hearing was the thing that made the case. Not because it was dramatic. It was not dramatic. It was a 12-year-old boy's flat, even voice in a diner booth saying names and dates and context that he had been carrying in his head for 9 months with nowhere to put them. That was not dramatic. But it was true, and truth in the specific form of consistent, corroborated, detailed testimony from a direct witness was what federal prosecutors needed, and what they had not had, and what they now had. He had stopped typing 3 times. The first time was when Eli said little Pete Cross's age. 9. Said it the way he said everything as information without emphasis. And Gage had looked up from his tablet and looked at the boy across the table and had thought about 9 years old and had needed a moment. The second time was when Eli described in precise detail the conversation in which he had learned about Jesse Roth, the specific location, the specific person who had told him, the specific words they had used, and had then said, I think she was scared even to say the name out loud, like she thought someone might hear. In a context where that observation was almost certainly accurate, where the person telling Eli about Jesse Roth had had good reason to be afraid of being overheard. And the fact that Eli had registered that quality of the conversation and retained it alongside the information itself said something about the quality of his attention that was not reducible to simple memory. The third time was at the end when Eli had finished and sat back slightly, the first physical relaxation Gage had seen from him in 47 minutes, and had looked at the coffee cup in front of him and said, I just remembered things. The things were already there. I just remembered them. Gage had stopped typing and looked at him and had thought about 2 years, about the financial analysis and the pattern recognition and the long nights following money through structures designed to be impenetrable, and the specific frustration of having built something that was correct and complete and still insufficient, still missing the piece that would make it a case rather than a theory. He had thought about the piece sitting across from him in a vinyl booth drinking coffee he was too young for in shoes a size too big, with the calm and careful manner of someone who has learned to be precise because precision was survival. He had put his hand out. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because he had not known what else to do with the magnitude of what he was feeling, which was not something he would have said out loud in that context, or perhaps any context, but which was real and was there, in which the handshake was his way of expressing. The boy had looked at his hand for a moment. Then he had taken it. And Gage, who had spent 14 years as a professional and 2 years as a motivated private citizen, working on a case that had started as a pattern in a financial record and had become in the course of the morning a face and a name and a pair of shoes a size too big, had shaken the hand of Eli Donovan and had meant it more than he had meant most things he had done in those combined 16 years. He thought about that as he rode south behind Grady's truck, keeping the formation loose, the 3 riders who had stayed behind him, in the easy spacing of people who were not in a hurry, but were moving with purpose. He thought about the 9 families. He had been in this work long enough to know what the next months would look like for the families of those 9 children. He knew the specific shape of it, the phone calls from investigators, the careful and necessarily incomplete answers, the long process of a case moving through the system toward resolution, which was not the resolution of knowing everything, but the resolution of knowing enough, of having accountability, of having the thing that had been done to your child named and recognized and met with consequence. It was not enough. Nothing was ever enough in this category of cases. The harm done was irreversible, and the resolution was necessarily partial, and he had known this for 16 years, and it had not gotten easier to know it. But it was something. It was the difference between a thing having happened and a thing having happened and being acknowledged. And that difference, partial as it was the thing he could offer. And he had learned to be at peace with offering the thing he could offer rather than withholding it, because it was not the thing he wished he could offer. He thought about Weston Ford. 6 weeks, 40-some days since the boy had gone to the Dawson Creek facility. In cases like this one, the first 30 days were the most critical in terms of traceability, because after 30 days, the systems that could be used to establish location began to degrade, and the record became harder to follow, and the window of specific actionable information narrowed. 40-some days was not ideal, but it was not yet outside the window, and with the financial record they now had, and with the federal resources that would be brought to bear once the Billings field office formally opened the case, which Okafor had indicated would happen within 24 hours, the window was still usable. He intended to make full use of it. He thought about the other name Eli had not put on his list of 9. Not because he had not said it, but because Eli had said it separately as something additional rather than something central. Tally. 12 years old, still out there somewhere, known to Eli from 9 months on the streets of Harlan Falls. He had made a note of that name. He intended to make full use of that too. The road went south and the mountains went past, and the cold held steady at the temperature it had decided on for the day, which was the kind of cold that makes the air very clear and the distances very sharp, so that the ridgelines looked closer than they were, and the shadows on the snow had a particular edge to them. Gage rode and thought about the work ahead and felt underneath the weight of it, something that he had learned to identify in himself over the years as the specific satisfaction of a thing that has been held and managed for a long time, finally beginning to move toward resolution. Not arrival, not conclusion, but movement, the shift from static to kinetic that happens when the right pieces come together, when the thing that has been stalled finally has what it needs to proceed. The case was moving. 2 years of work, and a 12-year-old boy in a Montana alley who had stopped when every practical consideration told him to keep walking. He thought that was worth riding to Billings for. He thought it was worth considerably more than that. The county seat of Stillwater County was 18 miles from Harlan Falls, and Sheriff Vance Pruitt had driven that road so many times in 11 years that he could do it without thinking, which was fortunate, because thinking was not something he was capable of doing clearly in the 40 minutes between the arrest and the processing facility. He sat in the back of the federal vehicle with his hands in the restraints, and he looked at the road going past the window, and he tried to do what he had always done when things went wrong, which was to find the margin, the angle, the piece of ground that was still his to work with. He had built 11 years of influence in this county on the ability to find that ground when others had stopped looking for it. He was having trouble finding it this morning. The boy. He had known about the boy. He had known about Eli Donovan specifically for 7 months since a county caseworker had flagged the name in the system for him as a potential concern. A child who was spending unusual amounts of time in proximity to other children in transitional situations. A child who appeared to be collecting information. He had placed the notations in the system without hesitation because it was the logical thing to do and because he had done it before with other children who had gotten too close to seeing too much. And it had always worked because children without documentation and without legal standing did not have voices that reached the kinds of people who could act on what they said. He had not anticipated that the boy's voice would reach Nora Decker. He had not anticipated that Nora Decker would survive the night. The break line had been a precaution. He had not ordered it as a certainty had not wanted the kind of attention that a dead Iron Wolves member would have brought, but Riggs had been told to make it look like an accident if the opportunity arose, and it had arisen, and Riggs had taken it, and the opportunity had not resolved the way an opportunity was supposed to resolve. Instead, it had put Nora Decker in an alley where a 12-year-old boy with a reliable memory had been waiting. He looked at the road going past. He thought about the financial records. He thought about the 2 years Gage Mercer had spent on them, because he had known about that too, had had people watching for exactly that kind of attention, and had believed for a long time that the structures were sufficient, that the layers of separation were enough, that the financial record without a human witness to the operational side was inconclusive enough to be defensible. He had believed that, and it had been a reasonable belief, and it had been wrong. The boy. He thought about the specific moment when Eli Donovan had stepped forward from behind the big man and stood in the street and looked up at him and opened his mouth and began to name the names. He had not expected that. He had not expected any child, certainly not a street child, with no standing and no backing to stand in the street and say those names in a voice that didn't waver. He had believed in the way you believe things that have worked before, that the system of invisibility he had constructed around those children would hold that a child who had no documentation and no guardian and no caseworker paying attention would be a child whose word could not reach a federal arrest. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong specifically because he had not understood that the invisibility the system applied to children like Eli Donovan, the invisibility he had weaponized and extended and maintained, was not the same as inertness. Invisible was not the same as absent. A child who had been made invisible was still a child, still observing, still remembering, still present in the operational reality of things, even when the administrative record said otherwise. The boy had been seeing things. The boy had been remembering things. And the boy had held on to those things for 9 months and then walked out into the street and said them. He looked out the window at Stillwater County going past, and he thought about the attorney he was going to call and the strategy that attorney was going to propose and the long and expensive process of a federal defense that was going to consume the next years of his life. And he thought about Cobb Riggs sitting somewhere in another vehicle having the same thoughts. And he thought about the deputy who had stepped back and put his hands up, whose testimony was going to be a significant problem. He thought about all of that. And underneath all of that, beneath the strategy and the defense and the calculations about what was salvageable, there was a thought he could not suppress, a thought he did not try to suppress because suppressing it required energy. He did not have a 12-year-old boy, had stopped in an alley at 11 o'clock on a January night and dragged a motorcycle club officer through the snow and kept her alive with his body heat, and in the morning had stood in the street and said 9 names. And the names had been the case. The thought was not guilt. He was not in the business of guilt, but it was something. He looked at the road going past. He did not have a word for it either. He thought perhaps that was appropriate. The federal vehicle moved through Stillwater County toward the processing facility, and behind it, 30 miles south on a different road, Grady's truck moved through the mountains toward Billings, and in the back seat of that truck, a 12-year-old boy slept for the first time in 24 hours in the warmth of a heater and the motion of a vehicle with one hand resting in the pocket of a leather vest that had been made specifically for him. The distance between those two vehicles was 30 miles, and it was also everything that could be between two people in the same state in the same winter, which was the distance between a thing that had been done and the person who had kept it from being undone, between a system that had been designed to make children invisible and the child who had refused to be invisible enough. That distance was not going to close. Some distances didn't, But in the operational reality of the case, in the practical geography of what would happen in the coming weeks and months, the distance between Vance Pruitt and Eli Donovan had already been resolved. The boy had spoken, the case was moving, the names were in the hands of people who would know what to do with them. That was the resolution that mattered. The rest was aftermath. The road went south and the cold held, and the winter did what winters do in Montana, which is to continue being winter without apology, pressing down on everything with the full weight of the season, indifferent to the things that had happened in it. The things that had happened in it went on. There were people in Harlan Falls who would talk about that January morning for a long time afterward. Not all of them. Most of the town went back to its routines within a day or two, the way small towns do, because routines are what small towns run on, and the disruption of a single morning, however significant, does not ultimately change the fact that the hardware store needs to open, and the diner needs to serve breakfast, and the dogs need to be walked regardless of what has happened on Harlan Street. But some of them, the woman who had come out to put something in her car and had gone back inside with speed, she told her husband that night and her sister the following week, and found herself coming back to it for months afterward, to the specific image of 72 motorcycles in precise formation in the January cold, and the boy at the alley entrance watching them arrive. The man who had walked his dog on the far side of the street with his eyes forward, he thought about it differently. He thought about the specific deliberateness of looking forward, the practiced nature of it, the fact that he had done it without deciding to, that it had been automatic, and he thought about what it meant that looking away from things had become automatic for him. And he did not arrive at any grand conclusions about this, but he thought about it. The woman behind the counter at Kepler's, whose name was Ruth, and who had worked there for 22 years, she was the one who had brought the toast that nobody ordered. She had brought it because she had taken one look at the four people who came in the back booth and understood that the morning they were carrying was the kind that called for toast. And she had not asked questions because questions were not what was needed. She brought the toast and refilled the coffee and left them alone and listened because the diner was not large. And she could not help hearing some of what was said, and what she heard made her bring a second plate of toast without being asked, and made her, when they finally left 2 hours later, go into the back room and sit down for a few minutes. She would not discuss what she had heard. She understood that some things you hear are not yours to share. But she thought about that boy for a long time afterward. The specific flatness of his voice when he said things that should have been said in a different voice, that should have had more in them, more weight, more breaking, and didn't, because he had been carrying them so long that the weight had become structural, had become part of how he held himself up. She thought about the toast. She wished she had brought more of it. She thought about what it would have meant to that boy if someone had been bringing him toast for 9 months. Not metaphorical toast, actual hot food from someone who had seen him and brought something without being asked. She thought she had probably passed him on the street. She was there every day and he was there every day, and she had probably passed him and not seen him and brought him no toast. She thought about that for a long time. It did not resolve into anything actionable exactly, but it changed something in the radius of her attention going forward in what she registered and what she did with what she registered, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, one of the things that mornings like that one leave behind when they go. The man at the hardware store, whose name was Dale Sutherfield, and who had owned the store for 19 years and had been standing in his doorway with a coffee cup when the federal agents appeared from behind the motorcycle formation, went home that evening and looked at his own records going back 4 years. He had had a county contract for certain supplies, and he had never asked too many questions about the specific applications because the county was a reliable client, and reliable clients were what kept a hardware store in a town of 4,000 solvent in the winter months. He looked at his records. He thought about reliable clients and what they were reliable for. He called the federal tip line that had been publicized in the afternoon news and gave his name and described the contract and said he was not sure it was relevant, but that he was available to answer questions if anyone thought it was. It was relevant. This was also one of the things that mornings like that one left behind. The quiet deputy, the one who had stepped back and put his hands up, the one who had been talking to the federal agents in his own vehicle by the time Eli and Nora and the others came out of Kepler's diner. His name was Aaron Briggs, and he was 28 years old and had taken the job in Harlan Falls 3 years ago because the pay was available and the pay was adequate, and he had not known what he was working for. He had understood what he was working for gradually over 3 years. In the way you understand things you are not looking for. And by the time he fully understood it, he had been there long enough that leaving felt impossible and staying felt necessary because he told himself there was nothing to actually act on that. What he knew was not evidence, that evidence was the job of other people. He had been wrong about that. He had given his full cooperation to the federal investigators from the moment they approached him, because there was no version of any calculation he could run in which cooperation was not the correct decision. And because 3 years of doing a job for a man he had come to understand was not what he had presented himself as, had built up in him a specific pressure that cooperation released. He would live with his 3 years for a long time. But he would also be the one who provided the specific information about the night Cobb Riggs had gone to interfere with Nora Decker's motorcycle, because he had seen Riggs leave and had understood what Riggs was going to do and had said nothing. And the weight of that silence was something he was going to carry into the testimony, and beyond it, in carrying it honestly, was the only thing he could do with it now. He cooperated fully. That also was one of the things the morning left behind. And in Billings, 3.5 hours to the south, the FBI field office that received Gage Mercer's 2 years of financial documentation at 6:50 in the morning opened the case formally at 9:32, which was the specific moment when the duty agent reviewed the preliminary package and the accompanying summary from the overnight call with Mercer and made the determination that the evidence threshold for formal case opening had been met. This determination set in motion a specific set of procedural steps: notifications to relevant supervisors, contacts with the United States Attorney's Office, the formal assignment of case numbers and lead agents, and the beginning of the asset seizure process that Grady had mentioned in the truck. These steps were not dramatic. They were bureaucratic, which is to say they were slow and specific and followed by more steps, and the case would not resolve in days or weeks, but in months and years, moving through the system in the way that complex federal cases move through the system, which is with the deliberate momentum of something that has been set in motion and will now continue until it reaches its conclusion. But it was moving. That was the thing that mattered on a January morning in Montana. It was moving. Eli woke somewhere south of the last ridge before the Billings Basin in the particular way of someone who has slept hard and briefly and wakes to find the world has continued without them. Still whole, still moving, still containing the things it contained when they closed their eyes. The mountains outside the window had changed character, the sharp ridge lines of the valley country softening into the longer, broader shapes of the approach to the high plains, and the light had changed with them, going from the compressed light of the mountains to the wider, flatter light of open country, and the road ahead stretched out in a way that was different from the road they had been on, with more distance visible in it, more of what came next already visible from where they were. He looked out the window for a while without saying anything. Then he said to the truck in general, and to no one specifically, "I need to tell you about someone named Callie." Nora turned slightly in the passenger seat, careful with her ribs, and looked at him. He said, "She's 12. She was friends with Weston Ford. She's still out there somewhere." He said, "I want to make sure someone knows about her." Nora said, "Okay." She said it simply the way she said things that mattered. She said, "Tell me about Callie." And he did. The truck moved south toward Billings, and the road went ahead into the wide, pale light of a Montana January afternoon, and the mountains fell away behind them, and the high plains opened up around them, enormous and cold and indifferent and full of distance. And Eli Donovan, who had been invisible for 9 months and was not invisible anymore, talked about a girl named Callie who sat on the steps of an old post office on cold November afternoons and cried in the quiet, contained way of someone who had learned that crying loudly did not produce results. He talked until he had said everything he knew. Then he sat back and looked out the window at the country going past, vast and cold and real. And he thought that there was a lot of it and that it was worth moving through and that he intended to.